This is Dimitri Lascaris for The Real News in Marrakesh, Morocco, and COP22. I'm here today with David Bleakney, the second National Vice President of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, responsible for human rights, the environment, childcare, and I think I missed one other thing, Dave.
That was education.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure, thank you.
So we today, you and I were both in a meeting with Environment Minister Catherine McKenna of the Canadian government and various Indigenous leaders. And one of the individuals who spoke quite movingly about the plight of the Indigenous peoples in Canada was Regional Chief of Manitoba, Kevin Hart. And I'd like to just replay for our audience some of his commentary today.
But of course, we're all here for a reason today. I am the co-chair of our Climate Action and Environment Committee at the Assembly of First Nations. And I've been given strict instructions by our elders, by our technicians, by our women, by our men, and by our youth, with the message coming forward that the time is now. We cannot go any further when it comes to pipeline expansion and the development of pipelines. And Minister McKenna, as well as your colleague, Minister Card, know full well that I've publicly stated I cannot support pipeline development currently or in the future, given the global targets of 1.5, that if there's any current expansion done in Canada, it will be next to impossible for Canada to meet those targets now and into the future. The First Nations people in Canada contribute the least effect of climate change in the environment, and yet my people feel the full effects in their communities. We have enormous rates of diabetes. I can speak personally about the high rates of cancer that are occurring. To date, I've lost 4 members to cancer. Most recently, I lost my mom in June, cancer. 3 weeks ago, my brother Lambert passed away because of cancer. In the history of my family, nobody has ever had cancer before. And yet we see cancer taking our people's lives in our communities more and more these days. And it's not just one form of cancer, it's only certain types of cancer that are taking the lives of our Indigenous and our First Nations people in our community. A lot of work has to be done. And it's concerning to me, Minister McKenna, that the government of Canada would subsidize the fossil fuel industry for $3.3 billion.
So one of the things that I noticed, Dave, during the course of the entire presentation today with Indigenous leaders, I guess in poker one might call this a tell, is that whenever an Indigenous leader talked about the conditions, the living conditions, which are quite appalling in many Indigenous communities in this country, Minister McKenna would nod her head, sort of acknowledging the reality of this. But whenever there was anything negative to be said about pipelines, she didn't have that same reaction. Now maybe I'm attaching too much importance to it, but to me it was kind of interesting. And that happened, of course, in the context of noises coming out of the Liberal government, which has promised Canadians, and did so last year, that it's going to be a champion of climate change, that it's nonetheless going to support the construction of tar sands pipelines. And one particular project I want to talk to you about is Kinder Morgan. And this is, as you know, the Trans Mountain pipeline that is planned or envisioned to run from Edmonton, which is the major urban center close to the tar sands projects in northern Alberta, down to Vancouver. And clearly it's going to be used to facilitate, if it's actually built, the export of bitumen to foreign markets. Based on everything you've heard and seen, particularly here at the COP, what do you think the Trudeau government's intentions are with respect to Kinder Morgan and more broadly with respect to fossil fuels infrastructure?
Well, I think it's pretty clear at this point that they're going to approve the pipeline. I mean, all the signs are pointing to that. And not only the pipeline, but even the way of dealing with climate change itself seems to be left to a private sector solution, as if the corporations that created this crisis and profited off of it are still going to profit off it and try to manage it. So I think that's the wrong course of action. But in regards to the pipeline itself, the announcement, I believe, is coming out a week before Christmas Christmas, which is an odd time, but not really if you want the story to be buried or less people to be paying attention. But when the minister was asked that question about the pipelines and explained that we can't afford them anymore as a species, as a planet, her remarks were that we're in transition, and this is a transition from one way of living to another. So that seems to me a very dangerous approach. We have the opportunity in Canada to actually really have a radical and positive and productive change and create green jobs to serve the community, I think, in unprecedented way. And I don't understand why in some of the discussions that it seems to be primarily focused on private sector and corporate solutions, when really the bulk of the people aren't corporatists, aren't owners of big corporations, and have the solutions that may be local, they may be in their workplace. I mean, even as a postal union, we're offering all kinds of solutions, and we're puzzled why, as a person on Treasury Board, which in Canada, of course, is responsible for much of the public infrastructure, is not directing public infrastructure money in that way, and then we continue to perhaps subsidize corporations like the oil industry to the tune of billions of dollars a year, when we could actually make, I think, a more beneficial shift immediately if we were to open this up a little bit and leave the corporations out of it. And having said that, too, I don't think her role really as environment minister is to be also minister of the economy or minister of corporations. That's not the portfolio. So I was concerned yesterday, and I wasn't expecting this actually, to hear so much talk about growing the economy and business solutions, and nothing, in fact, about public infrastructure. Some acknowledgement of Indigenous people in terms of their existence and their importance, but nothing really in terms of wisdom and the interconnectedness of things. And I think that's really missing for all of us.
And immediately after the session with Minister McKenna and Indigenous leaders, there was a stakeholder briefing. A term in and of itself I find kind of interesting. Stakeholder is sort of emphasis on private sector perspective on things. But in that stakeholder meeting, you asked a question about the apparent disconnect between the science and governmental policy. And in fact, you may recall the James Hansen, the NASA climate scientist, back in 2012, he penned an op-ed in the New York Times in which he said that if Canada continues to develop the tar sands, it's game over for the climate. Is it your belief that at the governmental level, at the highest levels of government, they really understand the urgency of the situation? Or do you think that they've kind of kid themselves? They found rationalizations, for example, a belief that we're going to suddenly develop some miraculous negative emission technologies that are going to save us. Do you think they really genuinely believe that the course of action they're currently pursuing, which includes continuing to pay fossil fuel subsidies, support for the LNG terminal out on the West Coast, as I mentioned, Kinder Morgan, probably also there's some support at government level for Energy East pipeline, which would run to the East Coast instead of the West Coast. Do they get it? Do you think they get it? Is that your sense from dealing with government officials?
I'm not so sure. I think that in a society such as ours, that there's this kind of a hubris, I guess, a human hubris that we can fix everything, that we can control everything, and that's a really mistaken way, I think, to articulate. And it was, I think, really exposed yesterday when the minister talked many times about growth, economic growth, and I don't understand how we can put growth in the current context of what that means, because of course there's other kinds of growth. There's green growth, there's compassionate growth, there's the growth in love and understanding and appreciation and the admiration of all living things. There's other kinds of growth that we could be looking at. In fact, some of the Indigenous people point to clues of sort of having that relationship with other things, and it's not all about a market economy. So I think that's the fundamental piece of it. Anyone that believes that a market economy will save us, I think, is mistaken. I think any economy that's based on constant growth and exploitation of Earth's resources, and more people and more houses and more products and more consumers and more roads and more cars, this is something that we, I think, have to think very clearly about. Is that where we're going to go as a future? And do we think we can manage that intelligently and effectively for the planet? And I don't think we can. There's been never any evidence of that. I think any thinking person, I mean, even as a young child, I mean, I asked myself that question, is if you keep building and taking and cutting down and stuff, where does it end? It's a finite planet. And so, there are no jobs on a planet that has nothing left, right?
Right. And that question, that theme of jobs, is one which even politicians on the right of the political spectrum, including Stephen Harper, would often invoke in order to justify the perpetuation of our dependence on fossil fuels. To me, it was a bit disappointing to see that, but not at all surprising, to see that the president of Unifor, Jerry Diaz, at the NDP convention, the NDP being supposedly Canada's Social Democratic Party, in Alberta, sort of the center of the oil industry in April of this year, I believe it was, he took a run at the people who authored and who've championed the LEAP Manifesto. And the LEAP Manifesto, I think, is a visionary document which incorporates many of the ideas that you were just talking about. Envisioning growth differently and not seeing the planet as something that should be relentlessly exploited to our, quite possibly resulting in the extinction of our species at some stage. He took a run at them, and Premier Rachel Notley, who was the provincial leader of the NDP, also said some rather unkind things about the authors of the LEAP Manifesto. And one has to be sympathetic to the fact that organized labor workers routinely get thrown under the bus in order to serve the interests of large corporations. So one entirely understands their representatives feeling this anxiety and expressing this anxiety. So I guess my question to you is, as a senior official in a major union in our country, how do we get organized labor on board with solving this existential climate crisis that we now confront?
Yeah, so I think labor has to join with Indigenous environmental communities as equals, and not be separated off from that. So I think that's really key, that we have those conversations together and start to have them more. But on the question of jobs themselves, I mean, what we see now is, are there good jobs? Well, there's some good jobs, and there's a lot of really crappy jobs. I mean, the finance minister, Morneau in Ontario, has basically said, suck it up, this is the future. So what we see is there are some people who don't work at all, and some people who work way too much. I mean, we even in our organization, we have rural and suburban mail couriers that can work from 6 in the morning till 9 at night, 10 at night without getting any overtime. So while other people in their communities don't have any work. So even the nature of the distribution of work is highly questionable. Now the question of, on Alberta and I mean, essentially we are a petro state. And we're a petro state in transition, and it's complex. It's like an addiction, and so when you have an addiction, there's going to be some friction, and there's going to be some challenges in terms of of working stuff out. But I'm convinced that we can do it. I mean, we have to. But I think since the Canadian economy has been driven so long in some respects, at least in the West, from the oil industry, although I would even question some of that, considering where the profits have gone and the devastation left behind and the environmental costs. This is a shift it's a process, and Notley, I'm guessing, is speaking to her own constituency. But I don't think she's speaking for the rest of Canadians, certainly, and those who are opposed to more pipelines. We got to get our sticks on the ice. We got to get our assets off the bench, and we have to construct a society now that makes sense and that can be sustainable for people that haven't even been born yet. And that's what the Indigenous say.
Right. It's interesting to me that you're here at COP22. I mean, is this a relatively new thing for the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, sending representatives to the climate conferences being held under the auspices of the United Nations? And if so, what's the thinking at the leadership level of why organizations like the Canadian Union of Postal Workers should be represented here?
Well, one is we think that you have to be part of the solution, not just advocating for it. And if you're part of the solution, if you're making changes in yourself, it gives you, I think, more credibility to speak about it outside. So we're looking at taking, well, for example, we're doing an internal audit of our operations, of our union operations. We're looking at retrofitting post offices and trying to get them CO2 neutral and sustainable, even perhaps community gardens around post offices. So we thought about this a little bit in terms of a plan, in terms, we can criticize the government, and that's fair game, but we also have to articulate. We have to claim space that isn't being claimed. And part of that is we developed a program called Delivering Community Power that looks at changing post offices into something more, into something amazing. And why? Well, most people don't realize this, but the Canadian Post Office, at least, is a public sector success story. And we have more post offices in Canada, that actually almost double, than there are Tim Hortons. And for those that don't know, Tim Hortons is an iconic kind of coffee shop in Canada that you find almost everywhere. We're double that, and people are quite amazed to know that. But we also have the largest vehicle fleet in the country and the largest human network in the country, human resource network. So we are perfectly poised to be leaders in this shift. And if we think about wars of the past, we took all the productive forces of society overnight and turned them into systems that we could respond to crisis. Well, this is the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced. It seems to me we should be putting all our productive resources to do that. The federal government has a successful asset, a productive asset called Canada Post. It's not just about letters. In fact, the Canada Post Act is Canada Post will change, adapt to the changing communication needs of Canadians. So we're thinking, well, why not community hubs? Why not electric charging stations? Why don't we as a union consider maybe putting a charging station on the side of our national office as a symbol in the city that this can be done and it needs to be done now? I mean, I think more people would buy electric cars and feed the auto sector and those other parts sectors if we had the infrastructure to do that. And so the science is here. We could do it. I think it's just lacking the will. But to rely on the private sector alone, they're somehow going to deliver, and especially the companies that have created this crisis, and the oil oligarchs, is, I think, a dangerous path. And so we really want to suggest there are positive solutions. We want to work with others. We've translated our program into 4 languages so far, and we'd like to do it into more. We'd like to bring other people into the tent and make suggestions or talk about things that we've been missing, because this isn't just about the post office, it's about our whole society. But the post office being rooted in that community across the country gives it a presence that's useful.
Well, let's hope that the government comes to understand the critical role that the public sector has to play in solving this crisis.
I hope so. And I would say in terms of Indigenous people, I mean, for us, if it comes down to having to make a choice of which direction to go in, I have no hesitation to say that we'll follow the wisdom of Indigenous people. We're only here by their grace. Our ancestors survived because of them, and we now see that they were really the leaders in terms of nurturing the earth and having sustainable societies.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, and let's hope we have a successful conclusion to this COP.
Thank you for having us. Thanks.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris for The Real News in Marrakesh, Morocco.